have everything in the chat that, okay, you're okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great.
You tossing it to me, Stephanie?
I am, Sarah.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. And before I get started, just to level set me, so I know everyone is interested in data science. Is everyone currently a master's student, undergrad? What's the undergrad? Okay,
Undergrad.
perfect.
Yes. Yes.
So
And
what
it's an interest in data science. Really it's all careers in public health, in agriculture, where data science can kind of fit in.
got
Um,
it. Wonderful. So what I thought I would do is give you all like a 15-minute overview of my background, and then would truly love to hear any questions that you have, and nothing's off limits. So feel free to ask about professional stuff or work-life balance. I've had the opportunity to participate in a lot of sessions like this, and I personally find them very helpful. And so feel free to come off mute and ask questions. But let me start by sharing my screen. And I just want to give you a little bit of an about me. Can you all, actually, I'm going to stop my email so it doesn't irritate you and
yes,
me.
we can see it.
Okay, perfect. And I'm just going to switch the screens. Okay, so hopefully you have it here. So I have found that it is always really helpful to not necessarily jump right into the sort of how do I spend my day, but what is a little bit about the motivations that have gotten me where I am. And I have spent roughly the last 2 decades in food nutrition policy research, very heavy on data, lots of secondary analyses, and I have loved it. In terms of my background, so I was raised in inner city Baltimore. My mom is Black, my dad is white, and the pictures here are me and their fathers. So that's me and my mom's dad on the left-hand side. He was a corn farmer in Maryland, and he left school after high school so that he could work in the cornfields and support his family and his siblings. And I was very close to him growing up. When I got into Harvard for my PhD, it was a huge deal for him. And I remember I was living in Los Angeles at the time and was driving cross country. And I stopped in Maryland to see my family and my grandpa and my parents, then was driving up to Boston. And my grandpa, who didn't talk a lot, he was very quiet, these giant hands, he put his arm around me and he pulled me aside and he said, Sarah, don't go up there, meaning up to Boston. Don't go up there and get uppity. And it was something that at the time, frankly, was in one ear and out the other. And then it came back to me when it was time for me to pick a dissertation topic because I was being pushed to do something that I really didn't want to do. I went into public health because I like the idea of helping real people in the real world. And this was not that. And my advisor got upset with me and sort of was pushing me and said, well, what is it that you want to do? And I looked at him and I remember saying to myself, Sarah, don't cry. And I didn't. And I looked at him and I said, I'm going to study obesity. And he said, why? And I said, because my grandfather will understand. And that day I went home, I called my grandpa and I said, Grandpa, I said, I'm going to write my dissertation on obesity. And I am 99% sure he had no idea what a dissertation was. But he said to me, he said, baby, he said, you're going to make fat people thin. And I said, Grandpa, you can't say that. That's not nice. But yes, I'm going to help people achieve a better quality of life. And I honestly have not looked back. My aperture, as you'll hear over the next few minutes, has widened considerably. But I've yet to come across a person of any education background in any walk of life who I can't have a wonderful conversation with about food, nutrition, obesity, and weight loss. And what I ask myself with every project that I do is, would my grandfather, my mom's dad, the one on the left, would he understand? And if he wouldn't, it is not the project for me. On the right is my dad's dad, radiologist in New York City, also very close to him. He was the one who told me that academia was a great career for women, and he wasn't wrong. And one thing that really impacted me so much was they died very close to each other. My dad's dad was pretty well off. He was a radiologist, as I mentioned. My mom's dad was not. And I watched the healthcare system treat them differently. And I remember being so confused because I thought, but I love them both the same. But that was the reality. And it is something that has really instilled in me a strong interest in thinking about how can I do my part to help drive racial equity. And then one thing that I made a point to do is I spent the last 2 years at the Biden administration, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the first year was COVID, and the second year was nutrition security. And in that second year, I did an enormous amount of presenting about sort of USDA's mission around nutrition security. And I always made a point to show this picture, which is me on the left, my brother in the middle, and my twin sister on the right. And the reason that I would show it is because as a Fed, as someone who was coming from Harvard, people had me at arm's length. They had their eyebrows up. They, often didn't trust me. They thought they couldn't relate. And then I'd start telling a story about I'm from inner city Baltimore. And when my family was little, we received what was then called food stamps. It's now called SNAP. We received WIC, we received school meals. And so I share that because, you all are interested in data science and maybe other empirical ways of approaching different topics, but I suspect you've gotten there because there is something about your background or your interests that anchor you. And I think as much as you feel comfortable, it is important to share that passion because it is both memorable, but I think it makes you more approachable. And the more fancy your degree is, the more high profile your job, the harder it is for people to reach out and try to touch you. And I think it is up to us to make that as possible as we can. And then I also always make a point to show my girls. So little Cecilia on the left is now a 2-digit number. Natalia on the right is going to be a teenager this summer, which is crazy. And I have been a single mom for most of their life, although I'm engaged now. So I'm going to lose my single mom mantle, which I used to be very ashamed about and I've become very proud of. But they inspire me. They inspire me to work harder. I know that the world treats them differently because of how they look. And that really pushes me to try to do my part and try to make the world a little bit of a better place. So I spent, as I mentioned, quite a long time in health policy, in my case at Hopkins after graduating from Harvard in a health policy department, really focusing in on food nutrition policy and obesity policy. But I got to a point where I felt, I don't really know how the sausage gets made. And I wanted to go out and get some real world experience. So I had the great fortune of being accepted into the White House Fellowship, which is a 1-year program. And I served during the Obama administration and really did that for 3 main reasons. I wanted to understand, does science actually have a role in policymaking? And if so, to what extent? I got a very different answer in the Obama administration than when I was doing COVID in the Biden administration. I wanted to really do the policy work with 2 feet. It's one thing to do things on a Friday afternoon or, carve out a little bit of time. But in the case of this fellowship, you have to stop everything to become a political appointee. And I wanted that experience. And then finally, what are the soft skills of leadership? I'm sure you look around and you see people who are very effective and you see people who are not. I wanted to understand that up close and personal. And really that is for me to try to help achieve my North Star, which is helping people achieve a better quality of life. So what are some of the skills that can get me there? We had an opportunity to meet with the president. So here I am with the 16 White House fellows. We had 16 fellows and 16 children between us. So it was quite a remarkable group of people. Here we are with the First Lady. And I put these pictures up because, one of the nice things about being on the compound is that you get to do lots of fun things. But that middle picture in particular is quite funny because those are my girls. I'd taken them to the East Wing on a tour. So you can see there's lots of people there. And they still to this day love hide and go seek. I turn around on this particular day and I cannot find my children. And so I'm like racing around the East Room trying to find them, thinking they're going to get tased by Secret Service. And I find them hiding under this table. So of course I had to take a picture and then, I yelled at them. But I put this up there because, this is what life is like when you're trying to corral kids. They don't care if it's a fancy place. They don't care if it's, super special to be there. Like they just wanted to play and have fun. And it's a good reminder to me about not taking things too seriously. And so it's something that I often share when I talk about that experience. I mentioned that I had the privilege of serving in the Biden administration. Again, the first year was all COVID. The second year was nutrition security. This was a picture taken on my very last work trip before returning to Harvard. I'm in San Francisco. This is right after the torrential rains. You might remember this is January of this year. And so now I'm at a point where the torrential rains have stopped, but it's still raining a bit on and off. And so we're visiting what's called a CACFP center. It's basically a childcare center where USDA provides food. And the rain stopped, and so we got to go outside, and a photographer snapped this picture of us hula hooping. But the reason I love this picture so much is because, at USDA, it was one thing to work at headquarters, and USDA stands for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It was one thing to work at headquarters. It was another thing to travel around the country and watch these programs come to life. And just the nutrition assistance programs, which are federally funded and state administered, they together, there's 16 of them. The largest is SNAP, which you may know as food stamps. They together serve 1 in 4 Americans over the course of a year. So tremendous reach. And they also did a huge amount for families during COVID by helping them get access to food. So there are a number of things that I took away from government experience. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm also happy to talk about life in the academic lane, which I've done for a very long time. But the one thing I would stress on this slide is if there is one skill that I have used more than anything else throughout my career, it is communication, written and oral communication. And then the second is really intentional relationship building. And I would say the number one thing that I always try to do, and my goal of every interaction, is I want people to walk away and say, I want to talk to Sarah again. They may not remember what I said. They may not remember the key things I wanted to leave them with, but I want them to have a feeling of she's someone that I want to maintain a relationship with. And so the final thing I want to share with you is now I've returned to Harvard and pivoted relatively significantly from doing a lot of research in food nutrition policy and also policy work in that space to taking on an administrative role, which really delves into Harvard and its legacy of slavery. So very briefly, a report came out 18 months ago, which revealed three very difficult truths about the university. One is that Harvard has direct ties to slavery. So Harvard leaders, faculty, and staff enslaved more than 70 people that we know of in the 17th and 18th century. The second is financial ties. So 5 men who made their fortunes in slavery and slave-produced goods, they contributed 1/3 of financial pledges and private donations in the first half of the 19th century. And the third is intellectual ties. So Harvard leaders, Harvard faculty produced ideas around race science, around eugenics in the 19th and 20th centuries, ideas that have since been debunked, but they helped underpin Jim Crow segregation. They continue in some cases to underpin white supremacy. The other thing the report does is it lifts up really nice examples of resistance at the time, Black students saying, I am going to integrate this dorm, or you can't kick me off the football team because I happen to be Black. And so when this report came out, it included a series of recommendations for Harvard to begin reparative work based on these difficult truths, one of which was to endow this reparative work in perpetuity. And so my office is stewarding a $100 million endowment to bring the recommendations of the report to life. And what I'll just briefly say is that the mission of this initiative is to address systemic inequities by really advancing our educational mission at Harvard and by being guided by the recommendations from the report. And essentially, we want to transform Harvard into an institution that is both accountable for the difficult past that we just talked through, but more importantly, active in advancing reparative efforts. So this is an entirely new space. It is by far the hardest job that I've ever had. I still have one foot in the academic lane. But what I want to leave you with before hearing whatever is on your mind is I have found quotes to be both instructive and inspiring. And I often have little sticky notes around my desk with various quotes. And these are 3 of my favorites. So one is, life's persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And that was MLK. Another, and with Maya Angelou, it's very hard for me to pick the right quote because there's so many things she has said that resonate strongly with me. But I really like this middle one, which is, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that is something, as you heard a few moments ago, that I take incredibly seriously. And then the final quote comes from a children's book that I used to read my kiddos all the time. And it's, life might have its failures, but this was not it. The only true failure can come if you quit. And so I would just encourage you to look for the spaces in your life where you find inspiration. If you're pursuing undergraduate studies, if you're pursuing graduate studies, this work is not always easy. And there can be many, many moments of frustration. And so you just want to figure out the things that really keep you focused, keep you grounded, keep you excited, and keep you on the path to the things that you want to achieve. So let me stop there. The floor is yours. I welcome any questions.
For all who are attending, if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or add them in the chat. That would be great. Do we have any? Oh, great, Veronica.
Hi, I'm very interested in what your dissertation was regarding obesity.
So my dissertation, instantly, it was dedicated to my grandpas. And I went back recently and I read the dedication, and because I was thinking about some stuff long ago, but it was focused broadly on obesity policy. The first paper took me 2.5 years, and it looked at this fundamental question of, are we getting bigger across developing countries because we're eating too much or because we're exercising too little? a very simple question that analytically was extremely difficult, and I had to combine a zillion different data sets. And I remember walking into my advisor's office and I'm like, and he tells me to do one more analysis, I'm going to throw him off a bridge. And of course he did. And I didn't do any throwing, but it was very, very challenging. But it is a paper that I still look back to today. It's called Why is the Developed World Obese? I also had the opportunity to travel to Mexico, and they have a really impressive national health survey. And they also had put in a bunch of healthcare coverage around hypertension. So I had the opportunity to look at the impact of that coverage across all of Mexico and also take Spanish at the same time. And then the final piece was looking at public opinion around obesity and the role of scientists as messengers. So a really broad portfolio of topics, very much intentionally so, because I thought as I was preparing for my dissertation that I wanted to be able to have demonstrated a broad set of tools and skills, because I honestly had no idea what I wanted to do when I went on the job market. And then spent a lot of time on the job market figuring out what it is that I wanted to do. What is the most rewarding? Wait, I just lost the thing.
What is
What
the
is
most, go for it.
What is the most rewarding moment you have felt after working hard for what you wanted to change? On the other hand, were there any moments you felt like giving up, and how did you overcome these obstacles? That's a great question. So I would say one of the most rewarding moments was, I'm going to give you two. You asked for the most, but I'm going to give you two. One personal, one professional. So as I mentioned, I strongly believe that communication is important. I also strongly believe that generally in academia and certainly in the public health world, we are handicapped because it is not a skill that people are taught. And therefore, lots of good information lives in journals and collects dust and does not make it out into the real world. And so one really gratifying moment came probably 20 years ago. I'm a newly minted junior faculty member at Hopkins. And I was spending time on the FM radio stations because I was trying to get messages out there around the need to eat right and exercise more if you're struggling with weight. So I'm on the radio one night, and it's an FM radio station. And at the end, the radio person said to me, if you can leave one message with listeners, what would it be? And I said, eat less, exercise more if you're looking to lose weight. Now, obviously, the message is much more nuanced than that, but fundamentally, that is the answer. Next morning, I'm walking into the Hopkins daycare to drop off my daughter, and you have to pass by the security desk. And I hear the security guard talking to her friend, and she says, I heard it from the good doctor last night. And she was a heavy woman. And she said, I'm trying to lose weight, and I just have to eat less and exercise more. And it was this moment where I thought, my God, words matter, but not just any words. Like, you have to say things in simple ways that people can understand, and then they have to be receptive to it. So for me, that was rewarding, and it continues to get me excited about trying to make sure that I'm always being an effective communicator. And I'm always thinking about, if I explain it this way, could I get my grandpa to understand, who doesn't have a lot of education, who is not part of these fancy academic circles? And then the other really rewarding moment is my girl. I was recently talking to one of my girls' teachers, and they had asked one of my girls if they could talk about, a person that inspired them and they were really proud of. And one of them brought my name up and talked about me as a role model. And I think, if you're a working mom, you're constantly torn about, am I spending enough time with my kids? Am I doing the right thing? And so it was extremely rewarding for me that they recognized the hard work, but they also aspired to a career that allowed them to also give back. I definitely have had moments of enormous frustration where I think to myself, I don't believe in the direction things are going, or I'm hitting stupid roadblocks. I got very good advice from First Lady Michelle Obama. I had the privilege of serving on that team when I was in the Obama administration. And what she said is, push hard on the possible, but do not bang your head against the wall for things that cannot happen. And for me, that has been very instructive. And so I will push very hard on the art of the possible, but when things cannot be done, I'll usually record it in the parking lot of ideas and hopefully try to come back to it. But one specific example of like an obstacle and where you can find inspiration in odd places is, I had a very tricky moment with a colleague years ago where we were writing a grant together. in theory, I was doing all the work, she wasn't helping. Now it's time to submit it. And I had gotten 0 contributions from her, so I didn't want to put her name on it, and she wasn't willing to sort of lean in and be helpful. So the conversation that I had to have was to say, I'm going to go ahead and submit this, but I think it makes the most sense for me to take your name off because I don't want to misrepresent you and you haven't had an opportunity to work on this. And she was a very prickly personality. And so I knew that it was going to be a tough conversation. And so I'm talking to a friend of mine about this conversation beforehand. I'm trying to square up what I'm going to say. My big one at the time was 2 years old and would have done anything for a piece of chocolate. This is my public health hat. Like, I don't give my kids a lot of sugar. So I finished talking to my friend, I hang up the phone, and my big one turns to me and she said, Mama, she referring to the woman that I had to talk to, she goes, Mama, she doesn't get a piece of chocolate. And I thought to myself, she doesn't get a piece of chocolate. So I took out a legal pad and I wrote on it, she doesn't get a piece of chocolate. And also like the main points I wanted to make. And so we had this conversation and she yelled at me and she said unkind things. And I kept my cool and I was very polite. And I just kept thinking to myself, she doesn't get a piece of chocolate. You don't get rewarded for being unkind. So the message in that is that inspiration can come from many different places. Sometimes it's people that are senior to you, but often it's people that are junior to you. And so I would just encourage you to listen and learn from those around you, particularly those that don't have a lot of fancy education, because they often have the common sense that can be very instructive. So I hope that answers your question. Did you develop your own style of communication, or did you learn from listening and watching others? That is a great question, Emily. So I would say that it is both and. I am a firm believer that everyone has a gift. And I think it takes a little bit of time for us to figure out what our gifts are, or our gift, singular. I figured out in graduate school that I was particularly good at communication. And the reason that I figured that out is I was working on an analysis and it was an R, which I really struggled with. I was more used to Stata. And I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. I reached out to a friend of mine and I was like, I need help. I can't figure this analysis out. And so he sits down with me and within like 4 keystrokes, he had solved my issue. And I looked at him and I was like, you made that look so easy. And he said to me, you make public speaking look easy. And I realized, I was like, oh, well, public speaking is hard, but it's not scary to me. I enjoy it. And that's sort of exactly how he approached his gift, which in this case was programming. So once I figured that out and I realized that there was this gap in terms of that important public health knowledge isn't always communicated, I really doubled down on it. And I started paying extremely close attention to people who I thought were good presenters and to people that I thought were bad presenters. And I tried to pick up nuggets along the way that were consistent with my own style. And I think that's the key, is you have to do things in a way that are additive and don't make you feel uncomfortable, particularly when you're putting yourself in a somewhat vulnerable situation of like, standing up in front of people and talking. You have to do it in a way that makes sense for your personality. So I would ask yourself, what are your gifts? 1, 2, 3, like what are the things that give you a competitive advantage that make you particularly have a value add? And then think about how can you hone them over time to make yourself more effective. And think about how you sell yourself when you're talking to employers, when you're talking to faculty members. I always appreciate the students that can say to me, this is my interest area. And these are the 3 areas that I'm particularly strong. Like I'm really good at quantitative analyses using this software program, or I'm really good at doing literature reviews, but making it easy for me to slot students in because I have a good sense of the things that they are particularly good at. Like what essentially is your toolbox? What is your shingle? Okay, Matthew, you find it difficult picking data sets that are interesting to me. Would you say you start with the research question first and then find data sets, or the other way around, or perhaps neither? Oh, this is a great question. Okay, so Matt, I'm not sure what you go by. So number 1, sorry, Stephanie, we'll go to you next.
Oh,
Every important question is not urgent. And so I think it is really important to make a list of questions, not 1, but like 7 to 8 questions that you think are interesting, that you would actually want to spend several hours banging your head against the wall trying to figure out, because even if it's hard to get to the answer, you're really excited about the possibility. And then once you identify what those 7 or 8 questions are, you need to figure out of those, which ones are amenable to analysis. Now, some of them are going to be impossible. Most of them are probably going the parking lot of ideas because the data is not available yet, or it's being collected. I used to keep a notebook when I was a graduate student, and it literally, the last page was called parking lot of ideas. And I would just like write down things that I thought would be interesting, but I couldn't do them because I didn't have the time or the resources. And then I would focus on the possible. And then once you figure out the topics that you care about, then you start trying to find data sets where you can get part of the answer from there. And maybe then you think about, okay, well, could I apply for some grant money to continue pulling at threads and getting at more answers? The hallmark of good researchers is curiosity. And so you want to be constantly thinking about, what are the questions that get you excited and that make you really want to do the work? I would caution you against just picking a data set and finding a question that fits within it, because it may not capture your attention. Or if it does at first, you may not really enjoy doing it. But I think it is better to partially answer a really important question than completely answer a totally uninteresting question, because then you've added no value to the world and you've wasted a whole bunch of your time. And this is where mentors can be really helpful, because maybe they can say, okay, well, you're interested in this broader question. I think you can get at part A if you do this analysis. And maybe you can do some qualitative work to get at part B, or maybe you just focus on part A for now. And part of the paper, the implication section is, well, this is helpful. Here are some other important gaps that we need to continue to understand this area of inquiry. So I hope that helps, Matt. Stephanie. Oh, how did I choose? Okay, great. How did I choose my career path as an undergraduate student, and which courses do I wish I would have taken or really needed once I graduated? Okay, so that's a great question. So I come from a family of teachers. My grandpa was a farmer, as I mentioned, and then other sorts of health professionals. So nurses, and I mentioned my grandpa was a doctor. So I thought, well, I don't want to be a doctor. Sorry, first I thought I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to be a teacher. I'll be a lawyer. And then I quickly figured out I didn't want to be a lawyer. So I went to undergrad at Columbia and decided, all right, maybe I want to be a doctor. So then I started taking all the pre-med courses. And at Columbia, it just so happened that biochem was on Thursday nights, the exams from 7 to 10. And then organic chemistry was Friday mornings from like 9 to 12. It killed me. It totally like took me out of the running. That was my second year. So I'm like, I don't know that I want to be a doctor, but I didn't really know what else there was out there. I had no real imagination. Junior year, I did a semester abroad in Zimbabwe. And I picked Zimbabwe because I thought, what's the farthest place I can go that I won't have access to as a typical American? And so I went to Zimbabwe, and it was 1996. No, I'm sorry, 1999. And I was one of 19 Americans living with host families in the capital city of Harare. This was when the AIDS epidemic was raging, and every one of us had someone in our quote unquote extended family, so people living in the rural areas, die from AIDS. It was the first time, I mean, I come from inner city Baltimore, so I'm no stranger to poverty, but it was the first time that I really understood the impact of health on well-being. So I came back to Columbia and I was like, I don't want to be a doctor, but I had no idea what I wanted to be. So I just kind of got a psych degree because that's where all of my credits were. So then I graduate, and mind you, I had worked from the day that I became eligible in Maryland, because like that's what you do. You get a job if you want to have spending money. So I graduated from college and I didn't have a job. And I moved to Los Angeles. I thought, I like warm weather and I want to stay stateside. So I'm going to LA. And my parents were like horrified because like you work in my family and I didn't have a job. But what happened is I moved out there and I fell into a job doing public health consulting. And it was my first exposure to public health. And I fell in love with it and I haven't looked back. So that's how I ended up in this path. And it sort of evolved into health policy. And now I'm much more broadly focused on poverty and systemic racism. But it for me has been such a fascinating field in which you can constantly both reinvent yourself, but also be like chasing ideas that you just find interesting and engaging. Yes, Stephanie, a question about USDA, please.
Yeah. So this is thank you so much for sharing all of this insight, like just into your past and like where it led you. When you were at USDA, and I think what sparked this question was your quote about it's not so much what you do, but how you make people feel. When we're looking at all this data that we're collecting, especially our work statewide in California with our college student population, a lot of that data will kind of help inform and create the bills that will eventually create that larger societal change, whether it's allowing students to get SNAP benefits, or to enact certain bills that are, or write certain bills that directly impact our academic gap among our students. But it's the feeling that you give to the legislators who actually vote for the bill, right? That when we're doing this work, we recognize that it's not an individual's fault, right? It's not an individual's responsibility to have the ability to eat like nutrient dense foods. But really, like in order to create the change, we need this data, but that piece about how can we get people to vote for it, that's the issue I feel like we face. And I'm wondering if you have any insight on that balance between the data we're collecting and how we communicate that to create the change we need. I hope
Yeah, it's a
that.
great question. No, it's a great question. So the number one thing is it is much more effective to speak in stories rather than speaking in statistics. And as an example, when I was in the Obama administration, there was this huge focus on obesity and food nutrition policy. And they basically brought together all the who's who from USDA, the White House, on the First Lady's Let's Move team, and the Department of Health and Human Services. All the folks that are making decisions across the federal landscape. And they brought in about 20 researchers to present their research. And it was so disheartening because everyone got up and talked about p-values and their methods, and there was no so what. There was no why should we care? Why does this matter for policy? What is the take home for us? And so it is really important that when you talk to different groups, you know the audience that you're talking to. So if you guys were doctoral students primarily, it would be a little bit of a different conversation than if you're more on the undergraduate side. It's just different messages, different ways of trying to engage. Similarly, when you're talking to a policymaker, what is most important is that you can give them the bottom line up front, the bluff. Like, this is why this matters. One sentence. Make your sandwich, give them the supporting evidence, and then wrap it up with a bow. Again, here's why this is so important. Ideally, put some scaffolding around it that's a story to make it really memorable, and then stop talking. You know, one of the things that we are taught to do importantly in the research space is we're taught to really think about what are the limitations of our work. What are the reasons for which our results should be questioned? That is unhelpful in the policy context. Because if you make an argument and then you explain it all away, that is not compelling. That is not to say you shouldn't be open and honest about the limitations of what you're talking about, but you have to be clear, you have to be concise, and you have to speak with punctuation. It is not uncommon, I think, or I've experienced, to have what I thought would be a 20-minute briefing turn into a 2-minute briefing. And that's where, like, knowing exactly what it is that you want to convey, where you start with a broader story and then you can drill down on the numbers, and not a lot of numbers. 3 points is usually enough to make the point. But I think it is a skill. Like, talking to policymakers is a skill, and it is not something that many students in the public health / data science space necessarily learn over in the educational setting. I think it's something that sometimes you learn by fire when you're in those environments. Does that answer your question, Stephanie? Anything you would add?
And the data visualization piece, I think, is also something that we don't necessarily focus a lot on, that we should, because it's that brief visual that speaks volumes. And when we I know, like, as Robin, you know, as a statistician, and she's teaching this to the students, many of them which who are here, when you really understand what data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, I think then you can present it in a way that will have the greatest impact, and that it is quite powerful when you can do that, especially like you said, you know, 1 or 2 bullets, 1 or 2 key visualizations can really stick.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. It's such an excellent point. And the advantage of explaining things in pictures, to use Stephanie's words, data visualizations, is then people can, like, tweet it out. People can push it out. You make it very easy to amplify messaging if you can figure out a way to tell a story within a picture. And I have a colleague who, for every paper she writes, her goal is to have a single graphic probably a figure that it tells the main point of the paper. So it's very easy for folks to pick it up and give it life. I realized, Stephanie, I didn't answer the other question you asked about courses and what I wish I would have taken.
Yeah.
When I was my senior year and partly my junior year too, I took a lot of courses I was just generally interested in, but they were courses for which I would have picked up a book on a Saturday. Those are not the right courses, in my opinion, to take. I wish actually that I would have taken more courses around data analytics, around evaluation, because I think that toolkit would have been very helpful to me. It would have been really helpful in my first job at a college. But I think as a general piece of advice, it is really good to be thinking about how can I build up various core strengths that I can then apply to all sorts of issues, because frankly, your interests may change over time. But if you've got a Swiss Army knife of skills, it's very easy to move around different topics. If you really only know one topic and one skill, then it's hard to have, it's hard to be fungible. What advice?
Go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. From Dr. D, what advice do you have for students as they explore future careers? So one thing I would say is, if you're anything like me, you will learn a huge amount about yourself as you interview for jobs, and you will learn a lot about what you like and don't like. So I would say that if you are at all interested, try, throw your hat in the ring and give it a go. In my case, when I finished my doctoral program, I can honestly say I didn't know if I want to do academia or private sector or government. And so I applied to all of them. The advice I got was, if you want to do academic research, you probably should start there. And that's what I did. And I think for me, it worked out well. But I think the key thing is to give yourself, you all are working very hard in school, give yourself the opportunity to figure out what it is you like and what it is you don't like. The other thing is, I would constantly, in any role that you have, I would constantly be checking in with yourself and asking, like, am I happy? Is this exciting for me? I have had the privilege of loving every job that I've had. I've also had the challenging moments of having opportunities come along and having to make a decision of, do I do this or not? And the really good advice, I had an advisor that I would always go back to, probably less than a handful of times, and I was seriously considering a different opportunity. And he would always ask me two questions. He would say, is this new opportunity a revolving door? By that, he meant, could you do this new thing and come back to where you are? And then the second question was, are you happy where you are? And in every instance, it was not a revolving door, and I was happy where I was. So it made no sense to make a change. But you should be thinking about, what are the things that you don't have in the job that you currently have that you might be looking for as a student? What are the sorts of jobs that you think you might want? Whenever I sit down with students, the question I always ask is, who has the job that you think you want in 5 to 10 years? And then identify a few people and then work backwards. Okay, well then how do I position myself to get there? Or maybe the job you want doesn't exist yet. And so then how do you build up a toolkit to allow yourself to get that job when it does become available? The last thing I would say is, I have had the good fortune, like I'm guessing many of you, to have a few mentors who have wrapped their arms around me and have decided that they want to help me advance my career. When you have those people in your life, use them. I think that there's a real spirit of people wanting to give back, of people wanting to reach out and help others. Let people help you. So much of the world that we are in turns on relationships. And so someone may be able to pick up a phone call and create an internship opportunity or make it possible for you to get a job. But don't be scared to ask, but just try to make it as easy as possible for someone to help you. So here's my resume, and here are some jobs I'm interested in, and that sort of thing. But really rely on others, and then figure out how you can help others as you move along in your own career. What skills do I use on a daily basis? Communication, written and oral. I spend a huge amount of time writing memos. I spend a huge amount of time. I must give a presentation almost every day on some topic, or I give briefings, or I'm in meetings and I have to sort of talk about various points. It's communication and relationship building. Those are the two main things. And I would say the second order is analytical thinking. In my mind, there are two types of people in DC. From the policy perspective, they're like the chicken with the head cut off type of folks. And then there are those that can quickly recalibrate with new information and reprioritize. And one thing that I am constantly trying to do is to think about, how do I reprioritize based on new information? How do I ensure that I'm using my best judgment? Because there is an incredible amount of incoming, and that's something that we're all experiencing. But are we leveraging our time in a way that makes the most sense? So those are the three things: communication, relationship building, and judgment. Emily.
Hi, Sarah. What a pleasure to speak with you. So grateful for your time. I'm lucky enough to be close colleagues with both Stephanie and Dr. D, and I'm our internship coordinator. And so I interact very closely with many of our student interns who are hoping to launch. And sometimes that can be challenging and overwhelming. And a question or a worry that I receive a lot from students is the "I should be" feeling. I should have this all figured out. I should have a job lined up by now. I should have 10 interviews in front of me. Have you ever in your journey experienced that kind of outward pressure of, I should have this all figured out, and yet I'm still curious about something over here, or I want to go back to school, or I want to try this thing that doesn't fit the path that others are putting out there for me? So I'm just curious if you've experienced kind of that outward pressure, and how you've kind of overcome that and stayed true to yourself and on your own path.
Yeah, that is such a good question. Anyone who tells you they haven't is lying, as far as I'm concerned. You know, the funny thing is, you know, if you look back on a career, it looks like it was all planned. And that this is, I'm not speaking about myself. I mean, you take anyone on this call, you know, if you look back over the last like 5 to 10 years, it's like, oh, that path makes sense. But there's so many tough choices along the way that have maintained that trajectory. And so definitely, I remember getting into a doctoral program and I was like, I'm the youngest person here and I don't know anything that's going on. And I felt, I mean, totally inferior. I felt like I didn't belong. And the way that I have always approached that feeling of either I'm not smart enough, or I don't have the right set of pedigree, or pick the area of inadequacy that one can point to, I've always just worked really hard. And that is something that I feel comfortable doing. I'm good at that. I'm never the smartest person in the room, and I've admitted that to myself for a very long time. But I do better when I'm surrounded by smart people who push me, and I'm willing to work really hard and to try to make myself rise. And so I think part of it is, when you're facing those moments of indecision, to ask yourself, okay, I'm never going to be as good as everyone around me, because that's not possible, but I'm as good. And how do I make myself improve? Like, what are the areas that I can control, that I can bring value? And for everyone, that's going to be different. But it's important to think about, because it really is easy to psych yourself out and to think that you can't do it. But I'm here to tell you that everybody, I think, has imposter syndrome. Everyone at some point feels like they don't belong. And it's something that you should both remind yourself is not true for you, but then remind other people of the same, because there are many people that choose not to go into these fields because they don't feel that they can or should. And the answer is they should and they must, because their voices are important to driving the conversation. I apologize. I'm supposed to be somewhere in 12 minutes and it's about an 8-minute walk away. So I should pause us here, but maybe Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you for any closing remarks, but just really appreciate your time.
And your time. Thank you very much. Have a fun walk to wherever you're off.
Thank you.
It's nice to get away from Zoom, right? Get away.
Yes.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, we have recorded this, and I think, Robin, you will be saving that and